Hey everyone, this is season 1, episode 7, and I have Chris Pass joining. So lucky 7, we're lucky to have Chris. And Chris is somebody, Chris, we met at, did we meet at HIMSS?
We did, my first time.
Floor. And our first conversation, I think, was almost like an hour and a half long. You and I just started talking and we realized we had so many common linkages and things that we were both interested in. So today we're just going to have a fun conversation with Chris, and also a meaningful one, just to understand how they're working through all the challenges they need to work through. Chris is the CFO at John Muir Health, an amazing health system and great customer of Strata. So with that, maybe just tell us a little bit about the organization, Chris, and your background, and then we'll talk about how you're working through all the challenges that are in front of you and the team right now.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks, Dan. That meeting at HIMSS, you were the first meeting I had at the first HIMSS I attended, and then ended up having to speak. But it was overwhelming to see that exhibit hall. But and I don't know if you remember or not, but you were sharing with me your hacks, and you had a meeting the night before, and you were going around with 30-second hacks. And I have found that I have borrowed more material from you of any other person I've met in the industry. So thank you for that. So I'm happy to get back.
Yeah, and those were mostly life hacks, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Exactly.
That's correct. Exactly. And it led me to actually take my son on a one-on-one vacation a couple years afterwards, and it was probably one of the best trips of my life. And I need to be a little quiet because my wife's in the other room. I don't want her to hear that. Anyway, so John Muir Health.
That makes me feel good. I'm glad. Yeah, that's been a meaningful part of raising our kids, is those one-on-one trips that we've taken. And now that they're 18 and 20, it's kind of hard to get their attention. So I look back on those trips, and yeah, they were very meaningful for us, for sure.
Yeah, my dad learned that the nicer the place, the more committed we all were to going as adults. So that's my hack back to you. How about that?
Exactly.
So John Muir, we are located in the East Bay of San Francisco. We have 2 acute care hospitals, do about 1.8 billion in net revenue a year. We have about 1,200 affiliated doctors. In California, we're not allowed to employ doctors, so it's through a foundation model, multi-specialty, urgent care centers, surgery centers, joint ventures, sort of the typical collection. What we like to tell everybody is we're large enough to have to do everything, but small enough to be a little bit nimble. So we service about 250,000 patients a year, pretty much spread out and affiliate with UCSF, Stanford Children's Health, Tenet, and then a partnership with Optum.
Got it. Yeah, so you guys have been really creative and innovative, and you especially are pushing the edge as the CFO, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a second. But you know, the world has changed pretty dramatically over the last few months, and just maybe you could speak to personally and professionally how you're working through it with COVID-19.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's and I call this the most overused word right now, unprecedented. And we actually had patients on the cruise ship that from the very early stages of this actually came to California when they finally let them off that cruise ship off of the coast of Asia. And
that seems like it was 3 years ago at this point.
Exactly. And so we were ready for patients. They ended up dispersing the patients throughout Solano County, which is a county to the north. And then we got a fateful call on a Saturday, and they said, you know, we're sending a patient and they have COVID. So we fortunately had about 2 weeks of being able to prepare. We had always prepared prior to, you know, once we learned of it, because typically we have a lot of travel on the West Coast back and forth to China. And so we started to see our first patient. And we implemented what's called an enterprise command center. And its sole purpose early on was just to communicate. There was so much swirl going around about this, and people coming out on the news saying we don't have patients, we have patients. And we were really fearful what happened when the Ebola cases came to the United States, and you know, everyone evacuated because they were scared, frankly, of Ebola. So our governor shut down the country or the state really early. The 5 kind of contiguous counties around the Bay Area shut down even earlier than he did. And you know, I'll talk to colleagues around the country, and they're somewhat still open. We've been shut down. So our mantra at home was, my wife literally was flying home from New York with a new Great Dane puppy the day the lockdown happened.
Wow.
Yes.
Good timing.
So that happened. And then when it looked like it was going to go on for a while and school was closing, we sort of said, okay, what can we do in our home to make this fun? So I think we've gotten a foosball table, an air hockey table. We had ping pong. Everybody has a new bike. And so we've been searching for these things that we can all do as a family. And so the exciting thing that I'll say about
you can do that under the umbrellas. This is for the kids, when in reality, the foosball table, that was pretty much for you. And we know how this works.
That's right. And the further we go with this, the more I think I maybe should have gone to the office, because I know I'm going to get in trouble because I talk too loud. Anyway, and I probably say the most beneficial part of this for me is I've become a novelty again for the family, because my wife and 2 kids are homeschooling and home all day with just the 3 of them. So when I walk in the door at the end of the day, I'm like something new that they haven't seen for 8 hours. And so they're just fascinated. So it's been really interesting to, not that I haven't had a great relationship with my kids, but it's just been fun because I am the daddy, come do this with me, come do this with me. So it's been a good time.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, I mean, you've always been a creative guy and a bit of a contrarian. And there was a recent article where you made the statement, frankly, healthcare is just too darn expensive. And you don't hear that from a lot of CFOs. And the second part of that discussion was you outlined how you felt Strata was really part of the fix. So could you unpack that a little bit and just give us a little bit of your thought process on both parts of that?
Yeah, and I'm sure you find this, your customer base, they all care so much. And, they all want to do the right thing. And I've had doctors and nurses come to me and compliment the skill set of being able to talk clinical. And that translation of clinical to financial is very difficult for many people to make. And so the thing that we liked about Strata was we could take a arcane 6-month process of a budget that people were entitled that, hey, we're going to put all this money in your bank account and you just go spend it during the year, to, that's not, you can't really control a lot of your business. Let me have you manage what you can control. And for a nurse who can manage a patient that they can see in front of them, or a floor of patients or whatever, that all of a sudden resonated with them. And so now we put tools in their hands that they can actually look at, they know how to use it, they've become advocates. And we actually created a Pied Piper of Finance program. So all of the departments have a Pied Piper that they go out and speak about the financials, and they explain financials in the terms that their colleagues can understand. And so the Strata tool we give them things that they can control: labor cost per unit, supply cost per unit, and we have targets, and we can essentially force the cost down, and everybody can improve 1% here or 2% there. Improving 10% is very scary. Improving 1% a quarter, that's kind of easy. And over 3 years, you take 15-20% out of the cost of healthcare. So your tool enables us to do that in a way that is not scary, frankly.
Yeah, well, I mean, but what is scary to a lot of people, a lot of CFOs, a lot of your colleagues, is making the transition that you speak now. That sounds so simple when you talk about it the way that you do. So maybe you could talk about kind of what went into that decision to shift away from the traditional budgeting process. How did that all come about, and how did you pull that through?
I have to give all of the credit to Mika Taylor. So she's in charge of our budget, financial planning and analysis, in charge of budgeting. And so this is a little unknown story. So I've been at John Muir a little over 10 years, and actually 11 years now. And I took over the analytics function, and we had decision support and budgeting, and that was as close to analytics as we had at the time. This would have been about 6 years ago. And Mika was just a star at that time. We worked really well together. She was great. And those teams were trying to figure out, that they want to go to analytics, did they want to go to budgeting? And so I was going to be in charge of analytics. Our controller was going to do budgeting. So I was making the pitch. Why would you want to do budgeting? Come to analytics. It's much better than budgeting. Who wants to do a budget? And the funny thing is, it's now probably one of the funnest part of our job. So we took the budget process, we watched all of the problems we had in the traditional budget process, and Mika, I think, had sort of attended some of the Strata user groups, talked to the colleagues, and said, what do you think about this and the forecasting and whatnot? And we likened it to somewhat of your home budget, and it resonated with us. We got the finance team together. Mika put on almost a half-day retreat, I'll call it, where we talked about doing this. Everybody got bought in on it, and then we needed to convince the operational leaders. And again, at that time, I was really young as the CFO. I was, or early in my career, never young, but early in my career. And we were getting ready to have this conversation. Our senior leaders belong to the Leadership Institute, so they were away at a conference listening to other health systems talk about how they do things. And I get a text from them saying, hey, Chris, we just heard this really invigorating talk about a new budget process. We want to talk to you about it when we get back. And so I respond to the text, oh, do you mean like setting targets that people can hit on an ongoing basis and ratcheting it down? Yeah. And so it became almost simple to convince them because they had heard it from someone else. Everybody was raving about it. It was an easy transition. We have folks who don't change very well, so they struggled with it. They were late to adopt, but they saw their teams save 5 months of time and endless arguments around, I'm not going to give $1 because you're going to give $1. And so it was easy to convince. We took it to the finance committee to talk about this dynamic budgeting and what we were doing. And you had this chair go, well, does this mean you're going to keep moving the target? It's like, no, we'll use our third quarter forecast. We'll present our target for the next year. And frankly, we'll be able to run forecasts every single month to be able to tell you how we think the year's going to go. Since then, I've heard many for-profit companies, non-healthcare, they run 5-quarter forecasts, and it's sort of a best practice. And so we've gotten incredible interest about this, both from the folks you talk to, but I interviewed somebody to be on our investment subcommittee. They were doing research on John Muir, found the article, and started to question, how'd you do this? I want to take this to our portfolio companies. This is fascinating. I mean, and so it really has been probably one of the most the most prevalent interest that I get from outsiders. And even to the point that with COVID, people, particularly June 30 hospitals, they're trying to put a budget together. The last quarter is a disaster. I was looking at some charts with our finance committee. Our volumes haven't been this low since 2012. So think about, trying to plan with this in the middle of it and having no idea if it's going to come back. So people were finding Mika through LinkedIn and whatnot, talking, how'd you do this? We need to implement this, and they need to implement it tomorrow. So it's been a really rewarding process. And to your point, maybe contrarian, but I think we're somewhat of a leader in that space.
Well, anybody who's going to be innovative has to be contrarian in that moment, right? Because that's what defines innovation, is other people aren't necessarily doing it. And you guys were definitely early movers. So you said a couple of things that kind of really, I don't know, I kind of want to dive into just for a second. One is just with what's going on with COVID-19. You said that there's been a tremendous amount of inbound interest coming to you, right? Just in terms of people wanting to learn. Do you feel like we're ever going back? So do you feel like those organizations who will flip that switch now will then go back to what they were doing before? And that's very similar to what's going on with telemedicine right now. You have to do it now, so people are doing it. But I don't believe a lot of people think we'll ever go back. I think they believe it's going to be a permanent part of our care delivery system moving forward. Do you feel that same way about this shift in planning?
I do, and I'll tell you why I do. I think there's certainly the telemedicine. I think is somewhat of a no-brainer because everybody likes it, right? Moving the budget, everybody doesn't buy in right away. But the other thing that happened that may not be as transparent to everybody is, I think, and we certainly did this, but as I talk to others, it's the same thing. We let perfection go away, and so all of a sudden we were okay with implementing things that were good enough because we had to. And so we put it in, we accepted the change, and then we continued to make it better. I think if people take that same learning, and we've all talked about what do we take from what we learned from COVID and continue to transform healthcare, if we continue to do that, I think those systems will never go back because they'll now all of a sudden adopt the process out of necessity, and then they'll continue to iterate and make it better over time. And I think they'll find similar to what we found. It's just a better way to do things because
and so unpacking that better way comment a little bit, Chris. If you were talking to a group of other CFOs at dinner and they were saying, hey, what are the biggest benefits that you've seen? Which is really what they're trying to ask is, how do I sell this,
Yes.
to my
Yes.
organization? What would you say?
So the reality of the budget, the day you publish it, it's wrong. And so the reality of a dynamic budget is you literally can recast it every month. And I would not be surprised if, as we continue to harvest more and more data and our ERP systems get better and whatnot, I wouldn't be surprised if you can continually forecast within a month, within a quarter, and you'll continue to iterate and make it better. And so the flexibility it gives you and the uncertainty of healthcare, and frankly, COVID proving that. I mean, nobody knew we were going to empty our beds out in the middle of March. That completely changes all of your plans, and it's hard to plan long term. And so I think having the tools in place that you also can engage all of your users and empower, frankly, all of your employees to make a difference, that's a huge win for you, because you don't want an organization where the CFO is telling everybody, cut costs, do this, do that. It's just, everybody goes into a survival mode, which is bad for everybody. So
Yeah.
you really want to empower those teams. I mean, nurses are highly educated, very bright adults. I mean, you've got this tremendous workforce. You might as well leverage it to do other things than just care for patients, so you can improve the financial health. And you can't do that without those tools. And a once-a-year budget is not something that they're going to engage with, frankly.
Yeah, I forget the estimate. I think there was a couple $1 million in savings just by cutting out this process for you guys alone. So you've saved all these hours as well, these meetings that really were meaningless. So I guess, take a broader look at Strata, so if you were in front of our team today, which in some ways you are, and you were to give a message to them about how they can really help heal healthcare, so how are they making a difference as a company? What is your lens on that? What would you share?
That's a great question, because there's a lot of ways to sort of answer that question. I think that the biggest thing that you're doing is you're making something in healthcare that is not front and center to everyone, but you're empowering thousands of people. And the more involved and the more folks you have involved in the system and the platform, the better we all can be from it, and the more we can learn from it. And so you put out a study, I think it was earlier this month, around, hey, what happened? And I think as you and I were talking, you realize, boy, I've got all this insight because of the power of the cloud and the power of the network that we've built. And so as you continue to put things in there, it's been inspiring to see you build this library of best practices. So now all of a sudden we can take those tools and use them. And I've talked to folks in other industries, and they're shocked how we don't collaborate with each other. Where he came from the energy or utility industry, he would call other utilities and they would talk about how to do things and share ideas. And he got into healthcare about 5 years ago, CEO of a health system up in Minneapolis or Minnesota. And he said, people don't share like they do in other industries. And you're creating that environment to share. So the more folks that your teams can get on board, the better it is for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting, just reflecting on this conversation, because it's almost like every other conversation we've had. And I always think about this because we talk to so many different CFOs. Like, there's two kinds of CFOs. You're either sort of on offense or on defense, and you're on offense. You're either regressive or progressive, and you're progressive. And then you're either pessimistic or optimistic, and you're really, obviously this is a very optimistic, forward-looking conversation. So I just appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your team and spend time, talking about the things that we talk about and really trying to make a difference in support of all the great work that you and your team are doing at the hardest moment in the history of healthcare. We'll never have a bigger test of leadership than right now. And one of the things that's always been, so thank you, I guess, first and foremost, Chris. And appreciate your joining us today. And one of the great things about John Muir is just the culture. And I found it really interesting how you called out Mika, and not surprising at all. So that is indicative of the kind of culture you have in your team, that your organization has. And I thought it might be good to give our team a glimpse of what that culture looks like. So With that, have a wonderful holiday weekend. Thank you again to Chris Pass for joining. And let's take a look at the team at John Muir.
Thanks, Dan.